102 bid for 100 sold.
All right, welcome back to the Fatal Conceits Podcast, dear listener. A show about money, markets, mobs, and manias, not necessarily in that order. If you haven't already done so, please head over to our Substack page, which you can find at bonnerprivateresearch.substack.com. There you'll find hundreds of articles on everything from high finance to lowly politics and plenty more in between, including, of course, many conversations like this one under the Fatal Conceits Podcast tab at the top of the page. Today, we're delighted to welcome back to the show longtime friend of Bonner Private Research and the portfolio manager of Woodlock House Family Capital Fund, a fund he co-founded with Bill Bonner back in 2018. Our good friend, Mr. Christopher Mayer. Welcome to the show, mate. How do you do?
I'm well. Thank you for having me on. Always good to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely. You're in, you mentioned before, a new place up in Maryland.
Yeah, I live in Mount Airy now. It's a nice little town. Very green. Lots of golf courses around. It's open. It's nice. I like it here.
Good stuff, mate. We were speaking just before we hit the record button here, and I told you that I would be remiss if I didn't at least throw out one financial question at the very top of the segment here, and that is, I guess, what everybody wants to know is after our June lows, we've had a 20-odd% bounce in the S&P, what many would consider to be the classical definition of a bear market bounce. Is this something that, first of all, that you agree with? And secondly, does it concern you as somebody who's sort of in it for the long term and more focused on individual stock selection?
Yeah. Well, everybody wants to know the unknowable, right? Is this the bottom, or we have more to fall, or are we off and running? I don't look at it that way. I'm focused more on the individual companies I own. And I have to say, this is probably one of the easiest bear markets I've been in yet, because I have now second quarter reports in hand for all my companies except one. And they're all firing on all cylinders. I mean, if you just looked at the financial statements, you wouldn't see any cause for concern. You'd be surprised that the stocks were down at all. So, I think times like this are an opportunity. What's remarkable, I suppose, is that the swiftness of this decline. So we're through August. This is the fifth worst start for the S&P 500 going back to 1928. So that's pretty, that's historically interesting.
Anything interesting happened in 1928 or thereabouts?
People like to make different comparisons, but it doesn't have to be a catastrophe. I saw somebody on Twitter had put out charts where they said one for the bulls, one for the bears, and they had set up the decline that we see now and matched it up perfectly with 07, 08. But then someone else, they'd matched it up perfectly with another market where it went straight up. So when you do that kind of data mining, you can find a pattern to make whatever argument you want to make. But they're all different in different ways, and this one feels different in that way, in that the underlying performance of companies so far is strong. And there are pockets of the market that are weak. Of course, if some of the retailers have disappointed, and the banks earlier didn't do so well, but by and large, things seem to be holding up pretty good. So I'm not yet I'm not concerned. I think this is an opportunity for sure. If you have any kind of time horizon, 5 years at least, I think you're going to be pretty good picking up some things today.
Yeah, when we spoke for your segment in Bill's Roundtable, which we recorded, I guess, maybe a month or so ago, you mentioned, of course, that, with the benefit of hindsight, which we would all love to luxuriate in 24/7, you look back at those other market drops that you saw in 2008 and before, and now they look like little blips. So, who knows what the future will hold. But if you had the steel to hold and even pick up some bargains during that time, you with some stock selection could have done very well.
Yeah, and the stock that I mentioned, I think on that call, has put in a new 52-week low today. So,
there you go. Maybe another
it's even better now, right? Yes.
There you go. Back up the track. All right. Well, looking at your bookshelf behind you there, we were also talking about one of the things that I love about our conversations, and for listeners and viewers now who are just joining us, I know we've got a lot of new readers on the Bonner Private Research Substack, so welcome if that's you. Chris and I have had a few conversations now, maybe 3 or 4, where we thumb through Chris's bookshelf and just kind of do a little bit of a deep dive into what makes Chris tick as both an investor and a thinker and a writer. So I'll link to a couple of our previous conversations there so you can get a little flavor of what we're about here. But we were emailing a little back and forth in preparation for this call, Chris, and you nominated a few a typically characteristically eclectic clutch of books, as you tend to do. Do you want to take us off from the top, maybe beginning with the classics, or where do you want to start?
Yeah, we can begin with the classics. So a lot of these books behind me are old philosophy books. This is my main study here, but then across the hall I got another library where my investment books and other books are, and then downstairs there's another little section where some fiction is, and since we moved, this library is about half the size that it was, but it's the way it goes. But the classics I had recently read and thought I would share is Rousseau, The Reveries of the Solitary Walker. He wrote this as his last book, and it's a series of 10 walks. So he goes off and he kind of writes what he was thinking about on these different walks. And I don't know if I describe it, I would say it's kind of a rumination on happiness, what makes people happy, what makes them unhappy. And so this is, old Rousseau kind of looking back, and he's an interesting guy. I mean, he's a really good writer, but I have to say he's also kind of a hard guy to like sometimes. I don't know. You mentioned in the email that you had read the Confessions, which I have not read yet, but I've heard about them.
Yeah, I read that recently, actually, just in the past, I want to say 6 months or so. And maybe a spoiler for some listeners who haven't gone through much of their Rousseau yet, but yeah, he had a long-running feud with Voltaire after a friendship earlier in their life, and yeah, Voltaire was pretty savage in his attacks on Rousseau later in his life, especially for perceived hypocrisy around the raising of kids and education and that kind of stuff, which is, yeah, it's pretty hard to like him after you discover some of those skeletons in the closet.
The way he just kind of left his kids at I forget, was it like I
think it was a church,
yeah, just for them to, it's unbelievable. But there are a lot of things like that. But then I think also he's very thin-skinned. He seems to take offense pretty easily. But having said all that, he's also a good writer and deep thinker. And in this book, he talks about things that make him almost sound a bit like an Eastern philosopher. He starts talking about what makes people happy comes from the inside, and not being too bound up with externals, and being able to be more unaffected by the vicissitudes of life. And he really comes to appreciate nature. There's some interesting one letter where he talks about how he gets in a boat and goes in the middle of a lake and just kind of lays at the bottom of the lake, bottom of the boat, looking up at the sky, and kind of loses himself for hours and in a kind of peaceful meditation. So I don't know, it's a fun read. It's an interesting kind of little, and it's not heavy reading either. It's pretty easy to read.
Yeah, I think some of his other works, Emile in particular, is kind of notoriously difficult.
Yeah, and he's known for his political stuff, so I know that can be difficult too.
Yeah, Social Contract and whatnot. What do you make anything of the kind of rambling philosopher at all? I mean, we maybe obviously differing vastly in their kind of worldviews, but I think back to sort of Nietzsche, or even who wrote in a very aphoristic style. He would go on these long walks and sort of just meditate on what he thought was important. Obviously, more recently, Taleb wrote his book of aphorisms, and it seems to be a one type of medium through which to distill your thoughts and get some clarity. I
always think of Henry David Thoreau also. He'd do these walks and he'd write in his journal.
Yeah.
Emerson was a great keeper of a daily journal. Kierkegaard was also someone who wrote avidly in a journal. I have his journals right there. But yeah, I think there's something to that, and then even in some of the great Eastern philosophers too, they wrote in little snippets, and Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching and Chuangzi and those guys. I mean, so yeah, I think that's and that compares to like these heavy, weighty, treatises that like Hegel and Kant would write. They're impenetrable. So I think there's something to say for that.
The critique on the top of my finger. Yeah.
That critique of pure reason. Yeah.
Right there. Yeah.
I have that there. That's over right here.
These big weighty terms that I wonder if those kind of system builders, the Hegels and the Wittgensteins and whatnot, they get so dense. It's almost sometimes a little impenetrable. But going back to, I've spoken about Thoreau before, and of course Walden, he's kind of epic there. Yeah. And he was social distancing a long time before it became cool on the outskirts and up there in New England. And I often wonder when, just by sort of occupational hazard, we have our noses so close to the screens, and we might be watching ticker symbols or, you're analyzing charts or looking at company reports and that kind of things. If we wouldn't benefit a little from just stepping back, getting some perspective, going to play a game of golf, going for a walk in the woods, and sort of decluttering sometimes. So.
Yeah, definitely think that's a good point. You got it. And there's a science about that too, about, you press yourself too much, your brain needs some time to sort of recharge. Concentration is almost like a resource. And if you're just if you constantly are at it, you got to give yourself a chance to regenerate. It's also interesting. Some of these philosophers like Nietzsche, some people think that it's because he had such intense migraines and a lot of other ailments that, he kind of preferred to write short because he couldn't sit there for that long and write, long pieces. I don't know if that's true or not. Yeah. Interesting theory. But it does also seem like some of the more philosophers who write shorter do have some love of nature too. They do tend to get outside, they're walking, and then they write down these observations. So yeah, I think there's some value in detaching. Even Bill has told me that before. He says, you should have some other outlet other than markets. He likes analysts to have some. For him, he likes his masonry and he's always working with his hands. But it's good to have something else.
Yeah, we over the summer, my wife Anya and I and our daughter were touring around a little bit of Europe. We went to visit the Bonners in their country estate out in very rural Ireland.
I was there in early June as well. So
that's right.
We were close in there.
Just missed
timing.
Each other. That's right.
Yeah,
but it is funny to see. Bill will do his daily work, and then he'll throw on the dungarees and march down the country lane and spend a few hours doing some masonry work and come back all kind of dusted up and for lunch or whatnot. But yeah, I think you see it's almost akin to when you teach your children, for example, they've forgotten a word, they get stuck on something, they want to say something, and for the life of them it won't come to them while they're thinking about it, and you have to kind of distract them and get them thinking about something else, talking about what they did that day, and then all of a sudden there it is.
I think like in the investing world, I mean, it's there are freaks like Warren Buffett who seems to have no interests other than investing.
Big Max,
I mean, he's really, I don't know if you ever read Snowball, which is a biography on him.
No.
And you really get into how he's really a strange guy. He has a diet of a 6-year-old, living in the same house all that time, not particularly well read at all. Like I don't know if he know who Rousseau was. I mean, he just doesn't have that kind of background. And no real hobbies or interests. I mean, he does play bridge, so maybe that counts. Maybe that's something. But very strange.
It's almost like a kind of idiot savant. You have all these unarrested developments in other aspects of one's life, but then when it comes to analyzing markets, his brain just kind of goes into overdrive.
A lot of the better investors I know, they do like to read and they are curious. So I think that's a good trait to have. You're learning about, because when you think about businesses, you're learning about people, and then there's people have different philosophies and styles, and there's I often think like you can tell this history of the world through any different lens. You could tell it through investing, you could tell it through music, you could tell it through food. If you go deep enough, they all kind of come together, and these same philosophical topics eventually crop up.
It's interesting, isn't it? That was one of Anthony Bourdain's kind of observations that he would use. I mean, you mentioned food, and we've talked obviously about travel and music and things like that before. And he was a great believer that the same conversations are essential to human nature, no matter where you go around the world. And you can use something like food as, something as common and as communal as that ceremony, as a way of getting into all of the things that were happening in wherever he was, Phnom Penh or Nairobi or what have you. He would talk to people and then you could learn about supply lines, you learn about living standards, you learn about history, you learn about the politics of the place, the economics, all of the kinds of things that you see reflected in a stock market, for example. You might see, if you really pay attention, reflected, breaking bread in some far-flung place around the world. So
yes, I agree with that, and definitely a big Bourdain fan. So maybe that seed was planted there. He's a guy. He's a guy I miss. I'd like to have him around, see what he thinks of some of this crazy stuff going on. Of course, there's a number of people we could say that about, but he was a good one.
What do you think of? We were mentioning as well. You brought up the biography of the Oracle of Omaha. Are there some other? I know you recently read Buckminster.
Yeah, Buckminster Fuller.
Fuller's bio.
It's a big fat book. It came out just recently. It's called Inventor of the Future by Alec Navala Lee. Mm-hmm. And I when I first saw it, I was very excited because I thought, wow, Bucky, as he would like to be called, getting the royal presidential treatment. Big fat biography. And he's hard to describe what he did. I mean, he was an inventor, and he was a poet, and he did all kinds of things. I mean, in his life, philosopher as well. I mean, he wrote books, and he was a coveted speaker. So I mean, he did a lot of different things. But anyway, I read this biography, and I think it is the kind of the definitive biography of his life, like the when and the he did this then and here and there, and kind of sorts through different events and separates some of the myth from what probably happened. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, it was interesting to read it. But in the other sense, it focused a lot on his personal failings. He had a number of affairs, and he had some other problems, and it kind of took away some of the magic. I mean, I don't think anybody, if you didn't know who Buckminster Fuller was, and you picked up this biography and read it, you'd walk away thinking, what's all the fuss about?
Right.
But he was, Steve Jobs loved the Buckminster Fuller, that famous Apple ad where Think Different, and when it goes through like 16 or 17 different icons, Buckminster Fuller is in that ad, and that was at the request of Steve Jobs. He received like 30 honorary degrees. He had something like 25 patents, and so, that doesn't really, this book, I didn't feel like it really brought home any of that. He was, again, a very coveted speaker all over the world. He had fans all over the place. So anyway,
it's interesting, isn't it, that when we talk about historical figures, even as, recently and sort of borderline contemporary figures like Buckminster Fuller, one wonders if they would be kind of given a start today, or whether they'd be, canceled, or
that's right.
People would focus so much on their shortcomings, where you're not reading a Buckminster Fuller book for marital advice, presumably. Yes. You're reading him for his philosophy on this, or his
that's a good point.
His thoughts on that. I wonder, in our haste to dig up the worst dirt on everybody that we possibly can now, how much of the good we miss out on.
Right. course, there's a lot of people like that in history, right? If you were going to go through, you'd hardly read anybody. I mean, shoot, Heidegger's one of the great philosophers of the 20th century.
He's
Nazi,
out.
he's out.
Ciao.
I mean, look at some of the stuff Hemingway wrote. Homophobic stuff and misogynistic stuff. Forget it. So, yeah, I don't know. It's a good point.
Yeah. All right, mate. Let's move on to your.
Okay.
Is it Deals from Hell? I think we've got up next. That's a great title.
It's called Deals from Hell: M&A Lessons That Rise Above the Ashes by Robert Bruner.
Wow.
This book was sent to me by a fellow money manager, and it's most of the book is case studies of M&A deals. But if you were to get this book, I would recommend at least just reading like the first 3 or 4 chapters, because what it really does is it sort of kills this myth that M&A is a bad thing, mergers and acquisitions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there's a prevalent view among people, even professional investors, they don't like acquisitions. And their view is when you do an acquisition, and most of the time it destroys value for shareholders. And in this book, he goes through a lot of research and studies have been done in M&A, and he comes to the opposite conclusion, that M&A does pay. And it's interesting for why that is the failing. So he says an objective reading of more than 130 studies supports the conclusion that M&A pays. And one of the reasons why the conventional wisdom fails, as he says here, people generalize too readily from the findings of a single study. So, there are some very high profile disasters, right, in mergers. And that's kind of what gets all the attention. Versus all the little deals that get done along the way that worked out perfectly well. So the tendency is to exaggerate the failures. And the key line here that I double starred, where he says all M&A is local, which I really like. You really have to look at it kind of on a case by case, deal by deal basis. And it took me a while to get over that hurdle, but now I've found some companies that are really great acquirers of other businesses, like just systematically are able to add and plug in businesses to their growing little empire and do very, very, very well.
So is this something that's affected the way that you think about the universe of potential investments that you come across?
Well, I would say
daily, weekly, monthly.
Yeah, I would say I have discovered this earlier. So I wouldn't say this book turn my opinion on it, what I think, because I've discovered that on my own, that the M&A is really nuanced, and I've discovered a number of these companies. People call them now serial acquirers, that have done very, very well. There's a number of them in Sweden. There's a couple in the UK, Halma, Diploma. There's in the US, there's several as well that just continue to acquire companies as their main avenue of growth. And they've been wonderful investments. So what makes those successful versus the failures? And this book helps kind of highlight that too. I mean, the failures are ones when you've got greater propensity to fail if it's a very large deal, if it's very complicated. So if versus smaller deals, if you're doing something that's in a business unrelated to yours, there's a number of things he goes through. But I think the value in this book is really busting that general myth and forcing you to kind of think more nuanced about the topic of mergers and acquisitions.
Yeah, it's interesting, those kind of myth busting those myth busting books, I guess, or skeleton keys or whatnot, that kind of turn things that you might have thought previously on their head. I'm wondering if the general consensus is such that I said murders, but mergers and acquisitions. Good slip, Freddie slipped there. If the general consensus is so far in one direction that might not be offer a little pocket of kind of hidden opportunity or overlooked opportunity for people who can kind of get past that.
Yeah, I think it did for a while, and then I think a lot of these serial acquirers are now priced pretty well. So I don't know that that's necessarily true anymore, but it might be. Sometimes it can be, and part of the reason I think is it can be difficult to model these things, and because you don't necessarily know when the deals are going to strike,
right,
or what they're going to look like, and if they deploy a lot more capital than you modeled, then there's going to be some big surprises. So it's a tough thing to predict and project. And so if you're willing to go with the kind of uncertainty and you trust the capital allocation, trust the team and the process that they have, and they have a track record of successful deals, and you can do that. You can look back and see whether deals were successful or not. You can see whether there are impairments. You can see what happens to the overall company's returns on capital, whether they kind of go down over time as they do acquisitions, kind of watering it down, or they're able to preserve it or even grow it. And it depends on the amount of disclosures companies give you. Sometimes you can, really dig down and you can see how certain subsidiaries they acquired, how they've done sales and profit wise, and you can kind of back in and say, wow, that was a really good deal. So I think that's the key. Is it's like most things in investing in life. If you can't go through too general, everything has nuance, right. And our culture forces everything to be kind of squished and reduced to a headline, or reduced to a soundbite, or reduced to like one single powerful message that you can deliver. But on most things, there's a lot of nuance and complexity.
Yeah, and oftentimes I think that looking beyond that kind of the black and white or the binary conception of the world can flesh out a lot of useful information. I was going to ask, because you touched on a few different investing jurisdictions there, Scandinavia, Europe. Do you find, I know, for example, that you invest, you have an international portfolio.
Yes.
Are there things that you look at in particular when you go into foreign markets? Say, for example, the transparency of their reporting, the maturity of the market in general, or does that all depend on price?
Yeah, there's definitely interesting jurisdictional differences. So even on this topic of M&A, for example, there's a solid pocket in Stockholm that there's like a dozen of them. And they're all good at it. For some reason, it's like a Silicon Valley of serial acquirers. Culturally, there's something there. There's something about it, and you don't see it. Like, you don't see anything like that in Germany or France, or it's just different. And in the UK, there's a few, and then in the States, there's several. But it's interesting to me sometimes about how you can have such big differences, in regional markets, even if you compare Sweden to the other Nordics. I mean, it's just there's a lot of differences there about how businesses are run. Like, for example, a lot of the Swedish serial acquirers will report on return on capital employed. I mean, they'll be right there, a number that and they'll be tracking it and targeting it. And I'm as an investor, I'm like, that's fantastic. It's what you want them to think about, right? And not this BS about sales growth or earnings, or sometimes these guys are focusing on the real things that matter. It's like they get capital allocation. So yeah, I mean, those kind of things are pretty neat when you find that.
Yeah, that's got to be, you toss a line over the side of your boat and Walden Lake, and you find a lot of what you like. You start fade up again, and yeah, good stuff. Were there, just going from the title there, I haven't read the book, but I expected there to be some horror stories in there, or is that just
Yeah, I mean, well, the classic, like AOL Time Warner, when Time Warner bought AOL at the top, and I mean, then you've got some horrific charts here where, where they announced the merger, and then the company, is worth less than like the deal value was. I mean, it's just a remarkable amount of destruction of wealth on some of these things. So yeah, there's definitely horror stories there.
Right, that's the headline grabbers that you were mentioning before that shaped public opinion.
That's it. That's exactly right. Those are the ones when people think of. You think of disastrous mergers, most people can think of some.
Yeah,
but
I was trying to think of the line from is it American Psycho? He's in Murders, and someone will write in the comments section down below what it is: murders and abductions or something. Anyway, let's move on, Chris, to your latest release. How many is this for you now, mate? You've got to be working on half a dozen.
This is number 5.
Number 5. Okay.
Yes.
All right.
So it's called
from Mr. Mayer.
It's called Dear Fellow Time Binder: Letters on General Semantics.
All right,
So,
you're gonna have to back up. You're gonna have to back up a little bit here because we're gonna get back into some previous conversations.
yeah. So,
Korzybski, lay out
right.
map the terrain for us.
If you read How Do You Know, this book is like a second crack at those ideas, except that I dropped the investing focus. So How Do You Know is really applying these ideas to investing, and then this is just a more general exploration. And I call it letters. I was actually kind of I say it in the preface, but inspired by Seneca's letters. He wrote these letters where he explained Stoicism, and there's some debate about whether they were really letters or not, but they were that he would mail them, but they were written in a letter format as if he was teaching somebody. And I thought that's a good way to do it. So I did this. If I were teaching someone these ideas, how would I do it? So what are those ideas? I mean, you mentioned Korzybski. Yes. Alfred Korzybski was a guy in the 1930s who sort of created this discipline called general semantics. As you can think of it more as kind of like an aid to critical thinking. It's kind of focuses on the assumptions that we make with different symbols and language, and how they interplay with how we behave. And there's a lot to it. Actually, there's a lot of different things to it. So it can get kind of deep and get into things about all kinds of things about causation and things we take for granted. So what makes this book different too is I was able to, it's published by the Institute of General Semantics. And so they gave me access to the archives for Etc., which is their journal they've been publishing since 1940s. And another publication they have, the General Semantics Bulletin. So these two archives, I was able to go back and I kind of mined them because there are some interesting characters that taught these ideas over time. You won't know them now, but they're in the book. People like Wendell Johnson or Irving Lee and S.I. Hayakawa, all these different people. And they're kind of interesting characters on their own. And so I was able to pull out different things from those archives. So, it was really interesting to read in the 1940s what, people were thinking about, worried about. War, of course, hangs over the whole thing. And so it was very appropriate then, because they were looking at things like propaganda and taking apart the meaning of all these different terms and phrases and the ideas behind them. So that's one thing that was really fun about doing this book. And I just did it kind of on the side. Pieces of the letter, some of the letters were already published in their journal, Etc., over the last couple of years, and then finally the book came out this year. So I wrote most of it actually in 2020.
Oh, and as you're speaking now, I'm thinking about the messaging, let's call it what would be called messaging today, or what used to be called propaganda before it underwent a public relations campaign itself.
Right.
From the department, which is now called public relations, but going all the way back into, I think it would have been in the teens, I want to say, when Eddie Bernays was just getting his start in the United States. He was the fellow that brought the world the phrase "making the world safe for democracy," and that was the banner under which he convinced Woodrow Wilson to commit American troops to World War I, a largely war-weary continent in North America that had only just sort of emerged from its own civil war a generation or so previously. And all of a sudden, we have, just with the quote unquote right messaging, we have troops marching off, and it does make you think, if that's happening then, if it was happening in the 40s, if this was on people's minds, it would be perhaps naive to think that this wasn't happening at some level today.
Yes. And it's interesting to think about why that stuff works. Why does that phrase have power, making the world safe for democracy? What does that even mean, when you think about it? And so that's kind of what general semantics, I think the biggest thing I've taken from Korzybski really is that, to be conscious of what he would call abstracting. So there's all these words and phrases that we use that really don't mean anything when you think about it. They mean whatever people want them to mean. They have dozens and dozens of different meanings. Recession would be one. Democracy would be one. Capitalism would be one. You hear about people talk about especially politicians, when they talk about our capitalist system, and then you talk about other people, and they're like, "What are you talking about? It's not. We don't have a capitalist system. We've got,
Yeah, it's a corporatocracy.
Yeah, exactly right. So, or all the kinds of labels we throw around, even political parties, saying someone is Republican or Democrat doesn't really say much.
Right.
It's freighted with assumptions, and then sometimes words, as we know, become so freighted with connotations that we have to invent new words, or we have to drop them. We can't even say the old words anymore. So
right.
you look like you suddenly have some examples to throw in there.
I know I'm not going to risk cancellation.
You lit up a little bit there, like,
listing off
yes,
a shopping list of unmentionables. But yeah, it's certainly the way. And I think also with regards to the way semantics is treated in our kind of modern public discourse, we have a narrowing of definitions that we're kind of permitted to use, or that we're almost shoehorned into.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you, while you were mining these archives or doing research for your own work, if you came across any time, it's kind of an Orwellian idea, but when the range of concepts, the range of language that we had available to us was so narrowed that it impacted the way that we're even able to conceptualize and think about things in the first instance.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I can't, there's a hypothesis I talk about in the book. It's called the Worf-Sapir hypothesis. And the idea is that the language we use actually actively shapes what we think. So what you're saying, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I can just think of Worf's examples, because he used to work in insurance, and he would say things like, so he would go, and let's say there was a fire started in some factory, and he would have to investigate the fire, and he would find out, oh, well, you see, there were these drums that were labeled empty, gasoline drums or something, and people would be very careless with them. They assume they're empty. They're not empty. They'll have vapors in them that are very flammable, and so on and so forth. And so they led to the mishandling of it. I remember there was another time where he talked about how there was this like pool of water where they would sometimes dump, like flammable liquids and things, and there would be a vapor on there, and someone was there smoking a cigarette, and then they threw the match in the water thinking he would put it out, instead lit the whole thing on fire. And
exact opposite.
So it's
unintended consequences.
Yeah, his point was, if you label these things differently, we would actually think differently about them. If you didn't say they were empty gasoline drums, you called them something else, people would behave differently. That's a slightly different point than what you're making, but it's so endlessly fascinating, because you can go on about this forever. But part of what this book too is, there's a lot of little helpers and things. Like, I know just from studying general semantics, for give you like one example, there's this whole thing about being mindful of absolutes. So when people say things like always and never, or they say something is, and all these kinds of things, always, so anytime I hear people use those, it's like a little light goes on, and got to be careful of that. So you get suspicious of certain words, and it can help you, because then you ask questions, follow-up questions to that. And somebody say, well, these immigrants are all, thieves. And you'll be like, all of them?
Yeah. Mergers and acquisitions are always a bad idea.
They're all terrible. Like, all of them? Everyone? So there's little clues like that, words that will kind of perk up. And as an investor, that's important, because I spend a lot of time talking to people and asking questions and trying to parse their answers.
We've never lost shareholders' investment.
Never?
Interesting. Yeah. All right, Chris, tell us where we can get your book here. It's Dear Fellow Time Bender. I'm assuming it's on Amazon, anywhere else in particular?
It's not very expensive. It's $12. It's 150 pages. I think it'll be a fun read for people who like to think about these kinds of ideas. Yeah, Amazon and fine bookstores everywhere, as people like to say, right?
Fine bookstores.
It's available everywhere. And Institute General Semantics, they sell it as well. So you can Google that, and you won't have any problem finding it.
All right.
And
Outstanding, Chris.
I don't get
Go
any
ahead.
proceeds for the. By the way, I don't get any royalties or anything. This was done for the institute, so all proceeds goes toward them.
All right. Okay. So I'll include a link to Chris's book and the others that we've spoken about here, Deals from Hell, and Rousseau's very last book of his life. And we didn't even get into talking any more about his particular ideas about some very interesting things. And I think mostly people tend to focus on, as you said, his political persuasions, the social contract, and that kind of stuff. But he's he rewards a whole summer season of study at the very least. So
I think so. I think if I had to sum up the big idea from that book, I'd say, his idea of people are naturally happy, but they become unhappy by comparing themselves to other people and focusing too much on external things.
The hell is other people, as
that's it.
Sartre said. If you exist in other people's opinions. Okay, Chris, I feel like we could go on for quite a bit longer going through your bookshelves and mine, but let's leave it there.
Okay.
And, we'll
do it again. Yep.
Yeah, good stuff. Okay, thanks a lot, Chris.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Good talking to you, Joel. Yep.
For listeners, again, do head over to the Substack page. You can get plenty of research reports, columns from Bill Bonner, Dan Denning, Tom Dyson, and myself, and many more conversations like this, including the ones I referred to, our past conversations with Chris Mayer, where we noodle through other of his extended archives. All right, we'll be back next week. Thanks a lot.